Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Trevor Smith-Miller. I'm the Communications Manager for the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. Thank you to everyone for attending today's webinar, which continues our fall 2024 season. If you are new to our webinar series, a little background on our group. CCSN works to connect patients, survivors, and other stakeholder groups, with decision makers and the wider community to engage in discussion and to act on evidence-based best practices to alleviate the medical, emotional, financial, and social costs of cancer. To learn more, visit survivornet.ca. Now, this webinar is being recorded and will be available on YouTube, and a link will be provided with the email that you registered with. We will have a quick Q&A session at the end, but if you'd like, you can put in your questions whenever you think of them in the GoToWebinar chat and question function. And now to introduce our presenter. Susan Marlin is the President and CEO of Clinical Trials Ontario, an organization established by the province of Ontario in 2012 to make Ontario a preferred location for global clinical trials while maintaining the highest ethical standards. Prior to joining CTO, served as the Associate Vice Principal at Queen's University. Susan worked with Canadian Cancer Trials Group for many years, coordinating cancer clinical trials and leading the development and implementation of the Ethics, Regulatory, and International Office. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Susan so she can start her presentation, Research Ethics Review in Canada.
Great. Thank you so much, Trevor. And thanks so much for asking us to do this. Research ethics is a big part of what we do at CTO, and we're really happy anytime we get an opportunity to share information about it. So I do not have slides today. Apologies to everyone who loves to have slides, but I don't have slides. I'm really going to talk about three things. One is the basics of research ethics review. The second part is really about research ethics boards and what they do. And then the third piece is kind of about where we are now in Canada and the evolving landscape around research ethics review. Just a little bit about me and my experience with research ethics. As Trevor mentioned, I worked with the Canadian Cancer Trials Group for many years, and in that role, especially in my latter years, I really focused on the ethical and regulatory aspects of clinical trials. I also worked with Queen's Universities for many years and worked with the research ethics boards there. I served as president of the Canadian Association of Research Ethics Boards. I've also served on the Ontario Cancer Research Ethics Board for 10 years. I've been a clinical trial participant. I've been a health research participant, and the newest thing I've added to my list is I'm now a breast cancer survivor. So that's sort of all the ways that I've come in and out with research and health over the years. So on to the basics. So really we'll start with when is research ethics needed? So it is required anytime you're doing research with human subjects. So these can be live human subjects on trials or filling out surveys or participating in focus groups. But also when your data is used. That means it involves human subjects, or when, for example, biological samples of yours are being used. All of those circumstances require ethics review when research is being performed. And, 200 years ago, there would not have been research ethics boards, but, unfortunately, we've had very troubling things in the past around the world. I'll talk about a few of those and some of the guidelines, policies, expectations they've led to. So the first one, which probably many of you have heard about over the years, are just the atrocities that happened in Germany or by the Nazi Germans. There were over 38,000 physicians that were part of the Nazi German Party. They conducted many unethical medical procedures and many unethical experiments on detainees in concentration camps. So there's a process after all of that happened to put in place some guidelines that I'll talk about. Another good example or bad example is from the United States. You may have heard of it, the Tuskegee syphilis study. So this was a study conducted from 1932 until 1972, so a 40-year study conducted by the US Public Health Service. And the people recruited to that study, they were all African-American men from Tuskegee University. They recruited 400 men with syphilis and 200 men without syphilis. And they were just simply watching to see the progression of disease, to see how syphilis developed in men. Unfortunately, 5 years into that 40-year study, there were penicillins available that could treat syphilis. But rather than offering those treatments or informing those men of the treatments, by the way, the men had not been told they had syphilis. They just chose instead to observe, the natural progression of syphilis. So by the end of this study, 100, or over the course of it, 100 men died, 40 of their wives were infected, 19 of their babies had congenital syphilis. So it was really an egregious ethical breach. So those are two good examples. Those examples led to several documents and principles that have been outlined for conducting research. So for example, the Nuremberg Code, that was developed after the, quote, doctor's trial, after the Nazi Germany atrocities. And it really called for informed consent. So you can't do research on people unless they're informed about what it is and they provide their consent. You cannot coerce people to participate in research. And research has to be based on good science and beneficence, which is concern for the welfare of the person. There's also the Bellman report developed in 1975. That was right after the Tuskegee study ended, and it outlined principles for research. This was a US-based report, but so many things we do in Canada and other places around the world were based on both of these. There's also the Declaration of Helsinki. That was in 1964 that was put together by the World Medical Association, and it outlined ethical principles for human experimentation. That Declaration of Helsinki is just being updated again now, but many of the main principles hold, and it's just being expanded to be more current with how research is done now. So I mentioned that in Canada, the things that we do built off of those earlier policies and experiences. The primary guiding document in Canada is the Tri-Council Policy Statement. It's often referred to as the TCPS2. Any research that's funded by your federal granting agencies, like you've probably heard of SSHRC and CIHR and NSERC, or any research that comes to any institutions that are funded by our federal agencies have to comply with that TCPS2. We also have ICH GCP, which is a standard for clinical trial conduct, but it also talks about research ethics. And anytime a company or sponsor, anybody wants to submit data from a study to a regulator anywhere around the world, they have to follow ICH GCP when they do those trials. Of course, Health Canada and the FDA both speak to research ethics, some basic parameters of research ethics. US regulations do. On top of that, institutions or hospitals and universities might have additional expectations around research ethics. Research ethics is also talked about in provincial legislation, typically privacy legislation around health data and how and when it can be accessed for research. And there are provinces that have kind of more extended regulations around research with human subjects. However, Ontario doesn't, but we would operate really according to very similar standards. So by the way, I should have noted up front, this discussion today will all be centered around health research for the most part, but as you would guess, any research involving human subjects, including, research into art, research into social sciences, et cetera, business research, it still falls under the TCPS2. So the TCPS2, and again, same principles as what you'll see in the Belmont report, in the Helsinki Declaration, all of the core principles are the same. The first being respect for persons. So respecting the autonomy of individuals participating in research, which really means seeking their free and informed consent before they participate in research, and protecting those with developing or impaired or diminished autonomy. So that's under respect for persons. The other big category really is concern for welfare. So the welfare is the quality of a person's experience of life in all aspects. And REBs, research ethics boards, and researchers should aim to protect the welfare of all participants. And then justice is the other key area, which is really about our obligation to treat people fairly and equitably. So equity really refers to both distributing the benefits of research and the burdens of research so that no population is unduly burdened by the harms of research or denied the benefits of the knowledge generated from research. That latter one, a typical example that we always hear of, for example, is pregnant women being excluded from studies. If they're always excluded from studies, whether it be for heart medication or cancer treatment or other things, when they need that treatment, there's not good data to support it for them. So that's kind of the basic of research ethics. So we'll move on to research ethics boards. So probably many of you have heard, the acronym REB, which is Research Ethics Boards, which is the terminology we use for the most part in Canada. You may sometimes hear REC, which is Research Ethics Committee, or you may hear IRB, which is an Institutional Research Board. They're all essentially the same thing. The US uses IRB, the UK tends to use REC. We also have private REBs in Canada, which are called IRBs, but it's all essentially the same. And they all conform to the requirements within their jurisdiction, as well as those worldwide requirements. So the REBs are composed of individuals that represent specific expertise, and this expertise is defined in these guidelines. They're not all exactly the same, but they're relatively the same. So there needs to be scientific, or relevant research disciplines kind of expertise. So if a board is reviewing all HIV studies, you would want to have people who have scientific experience in that area. All boards will require experience in ethics or bioethics law. And as well, all boards require a community member. This is often referred to as a patient representative or participant representative, but somebody from the community that represents the interests of people. Usually all of these people are volunteers. When I say that, I mean, really the community members are typically truly volunteers, right? Like they are not working for the university that oversees the REB or the hospital. So the community members are definitely REB. Sometimes the law members are. However, when you look at many or most of the people who compose research ethics boards, it'll be physicians that work in the hospital, nurses that work in the hospital, pharmacists that work in the hospital, statisticians employed by the universities, etc. So they're volunteers, but it is part of their job in a way and what they're expected to do as a member of the research community. Most guidelines will call for at least 5 members on a research ethics board. You will rarely ever find a board that small these days, though. Research ethics boards can review thousands of documents for approval a year, so they typically need a lot more than 5 members. There are many types of boards, kind of alluded to this, like there are university-based research ethics boards, hospital-based research ethics boards, private research ethics boards, and we have other entities like Health Canada, Public Health Ontario that will also have research ethics boards. So when, a good question is sometimes, well, how do we know which board our research goes to? Well, if you're working or operating under the auspices of an institution, such as a hospital or a university or Public Health Ontario, it is a requirement of that institution to decide what REB or REBs will review the research that you would do. So when we look at Sunnybrook, when we look at UHN, when we look at Queen's University or Western University, they all have research ethics boards. By the way, in UHN and Sunnybrook, that's a hospital, and all the research within the hospital is approved by that board. When you look at Kingston and Queen's University, it reviews on behalf of the hospitals, as does the Western Board in London. So the institution is responsible for designating that board. A lot of the time, the institution has its own board that all of the research has to go to, that's conducted under its auspices. So by you as a researcher, or if you're a patient in that hospital, if you're participating in research. However, there is a lot of research that's approved by private IRBs. That tends to be research that's done out in the community. So it's research done by clinicians who, operate an ophthalmology clinic or, a cardiac care clinic, but it's not within the hospital. And those boards are paid to do that. By the way, industry tends to pay for all of the research that is reviewed by ethics boards, whether or not it's in a public institution. So How do these REBs work? This is something that you really start thinking about the first time you're submitting research, because as a researcher or somebody working on a research team, it's a bit daunting and it feels like it's going into a big black hole and you have no idea what's coming back. I mean, they are determining the ethical acceptability of your research, and that feels pretty heavy. So what you do as a research team is you submit a package of information. So every research ethics board will have an application form that asks you a lot of questions about the research. Pretty much the same topics are covered no matter what research ethics board you go to. So you'll fill out a long application form. If there is a protocol, if it's clinical trial and there's a protocol, the protocol will be submitted, as well as any information about the treatment. So for example, in drug studies, there's often investigator brochures. They will be submitted as well. Especially for clinical trials, or most clinical trials, there'll be a written informed consent form that needs to go to the REB for approval. Anything that goes to participants needs to go to the REB for approval. So whether that be contact cards or anything else that might go, advertisements, anything that a potential participant or an actual participant would see, goes to the board. So really that application talks about exactly how you're going to do the research and why it's important, and any intersection with participants and patients. So if the research is above what we call minimal risk is the risk you would expect to experience in your everyday life. If it's above minimal risk, and all clinical trials are considered above minimal risk, the trial has to go to what we call a full board review, which means it has to wait for the next meeting of the board. Boards typically review monthly, about 2 weeks before. They usually have a cutoff. Your application has to get in before that. And when it's going to the full board, that application package, it's distributed to every member on that board. Most of the time, although not all of the time yet, that's done electronically, or you're accessing it through a system, but it's distributed to everybody. And typically 2 reviewers are assigned as primary and secondary reviewers before the meeting, and they do a more careful and thorough review. When you actually get to the REB meeting, you know, there's a big agenda, a number of studies listed, like for their initial approval. What typically happens is either the REB chair or the primary or secondary reviewer will just give an overview of the study, just to sort of get, you know, everyone on the board oriented to what we're talking about. Now, again, all members should have reviewed the package already. Probably is not in as much detail, but after that, once the study is presented, that's where the discussion happens. And really, the board is focused on, is this an ethically acceptable study? And if not, or if it's not quite there, what needs to change? So they will look at issues like the study design. You know, is there, like, the rationale for the study? Is there enough evidence to go forward to actually do this study in humans? Like, does it make sense to do this trial at this time? They will look at any and all treatments that are under study, and make sure that it makes sense. Like, if it's a randomized trial, that the standard arm is really standard, that it's justifiable to test the experimental therapy. They will look at all the tests and follow-up visits. Like, does that seem rational? Is that appropriate for people participating? They will look at safety concerns, so potential side effects. They will look at privacy concerns, how your data is going to be handled. They will look at the general impact on participants, like, if this is too onerous, is this too much for them? They'll look at potential compensation to participants or reimbursement for things like parking or travel. They typically do a very careful review of the consent form. Most boards that we work with, certainly in Ontario, and I think many or most across Canada, have what's called a template consent form, or a sample one that they give to researchers and say, please follow that, don't make up your own. And that certainly helps with the review of that consent form. But it's still, like, when we look in our database and why there are questions going back, many of the times it's to do with the consent form and how the study's being presented to potential participants. They're going to look very closely at how you would be found as a potential participant and how you would be approached about this study. And again, at the end of the day, they're just saying, is this worthwhile to do? Considering the time and effort that participants will put into this study, is this a worthwhile study to be done? Is it justified? So once that discussion all happens, It is very rare that there's been a full board meeting and there isn't at least one question that comes back to the study team. So, whenever we're speaking with researchers or study teams, we say expect to get questions, expect to get feedback. It's very rare that it would not happen. So, by the way, the other thing that's very rare is for an REB to just refuse to approve a study. Typically, when a study comes, even if it's not really, approval ready at that time, the board will send that feedback. They might invite the investigators to come speak at the next meeting. There's all sorts of things that they try to do to work with the team to get it to the state that it is ethically acceptable. Occasionally, they will just say no, and they will refuse the study, but most of the time there is a back and forth process between the study team and the research ethics board until the study is approved. After that approval happens, and we focus a lot on that first approval, but it's really the beginning of the process, that study will be under ethical oversight by that board who approved it until that study is finished. And even when treatment is finished, like let's say it's a trial where treatment is for 3 months or 6 months or even 2 years, for years afterwards, there will be follow-up of participants in those studies often. And for that whole period of time, until the study's closed to data collection, closed to all treatment, the board has continued oversight. At least once a year, there needs to be an annual reapproval of that study. If there are any unexpected serious adverse events that happen on that study, they're approved or they're reviewed by the board. Any changes to the studies, which are called amendments. So there's ongoing oversight well into the future. I mentioned, clinical trials are typically full board. There are studies that are considered minimal risk, so you'll see that more in surveys. Maybe focus groups or chart reviews, these sorts of things, they may be considered more minimal risk. In that case, the study will be sent to 1 or 2 members of the board, sometimes just the chair for a delegated review. That process can be quicker, but it's not always quicker either, depending on the questions going back and forth. So that's it for how REBs operate. Now just a little bit about the evolving landscape for research ethics review. So, when I think back, back when I was working at Queen's University, probably with the Cancer Trials Group, that's when the TCPS2 first came out. There was another guiding kind of document from the MRC, the Medical Research Council, but it was around then that the Tri-Council policy, the first version of it, came out. And at that time, there was a lot of focus on, research ethics boards being local. So you wanted people around the table who lived in the community. It would be people who lived in the community that would be participating on research, and it was good for boards to be local. And you often hear that term, local REBs. What we've seen over the years is a lot of change in terms of studies coming forward. There's a lot more complexity in research, especially in areas like cancer. The studies are getting more and more complex. So what we've seen over time is less emphasis on that local geographic context and more emphasis on kind of expertise maybe in other ways in boards or on research ethics boards. The other thing that we see, a lot, some boards will be at a hospital where there are a lot of participants that might have English as a second language, or a lot of rural participants, or, a number of Indigenous participants. But the reality is, pretty much in all of our hospitals, for example, across Ontario, all of those conditions exist when it comes to participant profile. So we need that expertise everywhere. So things have evolved over the years, not just in Canada, but certainly in the US and Australia and the UK and many other jurisdictions, so that when you have a multi-site clinical trial and there are 20 sites participating, that we try to move to, instead of each of those 20 boards receiving a big package prepared by 20 different research teams to review the exact same research study, that one research team prepares that application and it goes to one of those research ethics boards. So we see streamlining systems like that set up in Canada already, mostly provincially based. So we have one here in Ontario, CTO Stream. Quebec has one as well. Like, they actually have ministerial requirement that there be one ethics review for multi-site clinical trials. However, they don't really have one system governing it, so it works in different ways, but the concept is very much the same. British Columbia has had collaborative reviews happening for a long time, but there are lots of, examples of just, much more, one review being done and it being used by multiple institutions or investigators. So we're doing it a lot within provinces. What we've not accomplished yet is doing it across provinces. So instead of having, a review in Ontario, a review in Quebec, one in different places or maybe more than one in other provinces. The push now has been we need to get to one ethics review in Canada. And this is a lot about trying to get studies up and going more quickly. So, sometimes ethics review is sort of referred to as, I wouldn't say it's referred to as an administrative version or burden, but when you do the same process 20 times instead of once, it's really questioned why we are doing that. So some of you may have heard of the ACT Consortium, the Accelerating Clinical Trials Consortium. That is a project funded by CHR, almost $40 million over 3 years to help improve the clinical trials environment across Canada. So part of their objective was to impact ethics review and try to at least get conditions in place that could start to get us closer to that single ethics review. So they've recently held kind of an open competition with an RFP for a group to come together and do that. And we're very happy that we'll be part of that group and try and get that going across Canada. But it's not easy for many reasons you might expect. I mentioned that we have some provincial legislation in some places that provides just a single review makes it much more difficult. Of course, there are also always trust issues, even, certainly in Ontario, like CTO has been doing what we do for about 10 years. The Ontario Cancer Research Ethics Board was doing it for a good 10 years before we even started. And I remember being on OCREB at that time from the beginning. And, in the first year, we had like a couple studies come through because it took time for people to sort of like institutions and researchers to trust that an external research ethics board could do it on behalf of multiple institutions or just to create what they needed to internally to make that happen. But it takes a long time to gain that trust in a single review. And again, especially where we came from, with such an emphasis on local review, but that's been happening really well. And we have programs to support that trust and ensuring quality in the ethics reviews and the boards that review them. Other issues around systems, people like to use their own system. However, when we're doing a single review, it's a lot more efficient if we all use the same system. But anyway, these are some of the complexities we'll be working on over the next years. And I will stop there, and I'm very happy to take any questions you might have. And I can't see anyone. I was going to say maybe no one's there.
Oh, there are still many people there, and thank you very much
Okay.
for that rundown of ethics in clinical trials, because again, it's a very important topic, especially for on our end of the microphone here at CCSN. It's very important for a lot of people that we represent as well. One of the things that I would like to ask you to potentially help address the recent op-ed in I believe it was the Toronto Star, if correct me if I'm wrong, I believe it was the Toronto Star, about they use a lot of language about how to the effect of saying that there are some people out there who are being used that are using clinical trials and that are doing it specifically for a financial benefit, and as a result are not exactly getting the results that are going to be helpful to people in that kind of sense. I was wondering if you could say a couple of words about that for the presentation.
Yeah, so thanks, Trevor. So I think you're talking about the healthy volunteer trials, and I think the Fifth Estate did a show about it as well. So just a couple things. So for one thing, there's this concept of compensation for participating in research. So you being compensated for your time and your inconvenience for participating in research. Reimbursement is different than that. Reimbursement is usually a Tim Hortons card to help cover the cost of, or compensate you for your time and effort in getting there. Maybe you get reimbursed for your parking costs, like very small parts. So what we see in the kind of trials, so for example, we have over 2 trials in our system. there's not one trial like that in our system, like a healthy volunteer trial where people are paid to participate. Those studies are typically done when companies are in the early phases of developing therapies, and they need healthy volunteers to participate in the study. So it's not people with a disease condition, it's people that are healthy volunteers. So these are people that will travel and give up their weekend or a week or whatever it else is. They will take on the health risks of what's involved with that study, because they make that choice to do that. Those studies are typically approved by private IRBs. So what I mean by that is, the Sunnybrook, the UHN, the Queen's Board, they're not seeing those studies. Those aren't the kind that are typically done under their auspices. It's interesting because there's been a lot of back and forth since that. I think, we're all concerned when we hear that people are participating in medical research because they need the money and they're doing it that way. But I have to say it's been going on for years. There are no regulations that would bar it. Particularly, the ethics boards do have a say. Like, no one who participates on research is meant to be unduly coerced. But I would say, too, like for healthy volunteers, money seems to be a driver for some of them when they're participating on that research. It may not be for all of them, though. Some of them may be just really interested in being part of medical research and contributing that way. But I was going to say, even with, for want of a better description, non-healthy volunteers, but, people who have a health condition and there is inadequate treatment for, they have a reason for going on those studies. Sometimes it's 100% altruistic, especially in later phase studies in cancer, for example. They just want to help with future knowledge because, the trial itself is anyway, it's at a stage where it may not be curative or helpful for them. But, a lot of people go on studies because they want access to that new treatment or the experimental treatment. Or a good reason to go on a clinical trial is you tend to get better follow-up. Studies have shown that there's better outcomes for people who participate on trial. So I think we're all, to some degree incentivized by different things. In the perfect world, there would be, I don't know, the incentives would be so clean and so clear that there wouldn't be concerns about people doing it for the money. But anyway, it happens. Yeah.
Absolutely. And from a lot of perspective, from our perspective, and a lot of different patient groups, there is a lot of times when clinical trials are your only chance to find any sort of treatment or that will help you. So, in that case, it's very interesting to point out that everyone is doing these things for a particular reason. And when they that are, some ways are very altruistic, but in a lot of cases, it's that, that might be your best chance to uh, finding a way to deal or to with the condition that you have. Once again, if you'd like to put any questions in the tab, by all means, please put them in as soon as you can. Another question that I was wanted to ask you about small uh, sample sizes, and in a lot of cases, I mean, with Clinical Trials Ontario, they probably have to deal with a lot of rare cancers and also a lot of rare different diseases that are experienced by a very small number of the population. But how do you go about finding those people and having them participate in an ethical way in that kind of sense, when you know that there's going to only be a very small sample size? And is there a point where you have to say that the sample size is too small? How do you kind of balance out the the ethics of have making sure that, sorry, the ethical implications of that, um, whenever some sample group is too small?
Yeah. So, you know, for a study to be ethically acceptable, it has to be scientifically acceptable as well. So if the sample size for a clinical trial that's under review by an ethics board is not supported by solid statistical analysis in determining the sample size that's appropriate, it would not pass ethics review. With that being said, it typically doesn't happen that a research team or a company, a sponsor, would put forward a study that couldn't answer the question that it says it's going to answer. When we're looking at rare disease, the considerations, I think, are like, at least they're very clear and they're outlined. And how to say this, but like, the trials have to happen, like, to determine which therapies are going to work. There's typically a large emphasis on multi-center trials. In really rare diseases, you'll have sites open up with no patients ever coming on in that site. But really, at the end of the day, if you're going to ask a question, you have to plan to get the right data to answer the question, and that's the only way it's ethical. Now, there's alternative methods, for example, like with rare disease, having the comparator group being case controls. That's, if you're working with real world evidence, that can be a way of doing things. But at this point in time, we're not really, but my experience is we're not seeing that in play yet. These are more things we're talking about rather than being routinely used. Although I think that they have been used, but it's probably not routine yet.
Once again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put it in the questions tab. You mentioned actually about regulations and how there are certain parts of that there are certain clinical trials that they don't necessarily have those same kind of guardrails. Are there any regulations or specific guardrails that you can think of that you would potentially want to see implemented, not just specifically for clinical trials in Ontario, but from abroad? Is there anything that should be implemented that will improve patient safety and ethics in that sense?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I have to say, we really come from a privileged position here in Canada. So, we're, a destination country to do clinical trials. We have a really solid healthcare system that underpins the trials. The ethics boards that exist across the country do fantastic jobs. The institutions are so concerned. There's not that much about I'm concerned here. When you look at lower and middle income countries, there might be more concerns. And that sounds so first world centric. And by the way, I don't think it's more to do with resource, right, and capability. But what I would say is certainly when anyone living in Canada and working in an institution in Canada is doing research around the world, the expectations are the same of them, no matter where they go, in terms of the ethical principles that they put in play. But I don't know, just like the things like the Declaration of Helsinki, ICH-GCP, the Nuremberg Code, like all of these things apply everywhere pretty much in the world where there's infrastructure and resources to do clinical trials. Kind of. I say that kind of, yeah. Well, it's but yeah, kind of.
Well,
I'm just thinking about, like, in countries where healthcare isn't readily available or affordable, if the only way you can have access to healthcare and medication is on trial, that's not great.
Right.
So again, by the way, we have people living in Canada who the only way they can get access to something is to be on a clinical trial, but it can certainly be more widespread in different places where resources are not as good, for sure.
Absolutely. Sharon asks, do or should research ethics boards consider the ethics of using surrogate endpoints that may not predict clinical outcomes?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Sharon. Like, I worked in cancer clinical trials for years, and the surrogate or endpoints along the way, such as time to progression or recurrence or these sorts of things, they didn't always translate into survival. So I think when you're using surrogate endpoints, I mean, it comes back to, what question are you asking? What are you trying to solve that day? Like, or what are you trying to solve at that time or determine at that time? And what's most important in that patient population? So, many trials will use surrogate endpoints along the way, but and they'll stop. That will be the primary outcome. But I would advocate for continually following people for survival, especially in with long-term kind of disease. It's a really important thing.
Mhm. All right, we're almost out of time, but one final question for you. What is the role of a community member on a research ethics board, and how do people become a community member?
Oh, very good questions. So the community member is a member of the board like everybody else, like, kind of equal responsibilities to review all of the materials and all of the studies that come forward, and equal say and voice around the table. And if you're a community member and that's not happening, that's a problem. But in my experience, that always happens. The other thing that I've seen is with some boards, for example, they will, hope or expect the community member to do a much closer review of the consent form than other people, with maybe the idea that they can put themselves better in the seat of an individual who might be considering that therapy. So, when scientists review consent forms, their language might, what they expect could be quite different than what a community member would be. But essentially, they're there like everybody else. They're a voting member of the board, and they're very important voting member of the board. How you get on a board, I love this question because every time we're talking to boards, quite often they're saying, how do we find community members? Like, how do we find people to sit on the boards? So often what I've seen happen is, for example, patients might be involved with their hospitals in terms of providing input on other things. So they may be known in that way to either investigators or hospital administration. So they might be found in that way. I've seen community members, because somebody around the board has a neighbor that they know that's really interested. Like, it can happen in almost any way you can imagine. I'm trying to think if I've ever seen them publicly advertised, like in newspapers. I'm not sure I have, but it's something that boards struggle with a lot, or some anyways, keeping community members or finding them when they need them. Yeah, that was a long answer to say it's all over the map how it happens.
Hmm. All right, excellent. Thank you very much, Susan, for this presentation. It was a fantastic presentation. It also was an eye-opener about how these things happen, and it's also a big point of interest for our community as well. So thank you very much for taking the time to chat about the topic with us very much.
You're very welcome.
Hmm.
Thanks,
Also,
everyone.
also, I'd like to extend a thanks to Don Richards, who helped facilitate this talk. So thank you very much, Don, for your work with this as well. And this is also one of a series of webinars that we are presenting this fall. Our next one should be happening next week. So to stay in the loop with our webinars, visit our website or check your email for our e-blast. If you're not seeing the email in your inbox, it could be in your spam folder because we do use a third-party email service. But if not, you can go over to our website where you can subscribe to our newsletter, survivornet.ca. And to subscribe to our newsletter, you can see everything that we're doing here at CCSN. All webinars can be found at survivornet.ca or on CCSN's YouTube channel. And so with that, I hope everyone has a good rest of their day, and we'll see you on the next one.